welcome back to the Rocky Mountain Writer podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's so great to be back. I always love coming.
Oh, it's great to have you on. You have been on, I didn't go back and count, but I should, a number of times, and we always learn a lot. It's great. And wow, you've just been very busy, as we will find out in this podcast. But before we get into the latest book, A Bakery in Paris, which just came out, hey, look at her. Now there's a marketing. Yeah. For those listening, Aimie just held up the book. She's quite smart to do so. But before we get into A Bakery in Paris, you recently moved up to Estes Park. It's not super recent, but yeah. Tell us about that move.
Yeah, well, I moved up in late March, early April of 2021, to move up here. My husband is my new husband. We got married in June, just a couple months after I moved up here. His parents live up here full time in Estes Park, and he splits his time between the University of Arizona and Estes Park because he is a professor of history at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And so we just decided that it was a great place to raise the kids and to, so they're around extended family all the time. And it's a lovely small community. And we just love the idea of moving up here. So we've been here for 2 years now.
What are some of the pros, and if there are any cons, to you as a writer, from the writer side of things? Because you've gone from a metro Denver area of a couple million people or whatever to a town of how many?
6,000 people, though that number kind of expands in the summer quite a bit through elk season. We're kind of in a lull. It's funny is that you become very attuned to seasonal living. Right now we're in the phase where it's kind of busy on the weekends, but it's very quiet during the work week because schools have gone back. And so the people here are staying a week or two. They're often repeat visitors. But, from, the Memorial Day to like mid-August is just insane every day. And then we have a big boom for elk season here in a couple weeks, and the colors, and it's wonderful. But as a writer, I find that I draw a lot of inspiration from peace and quiet, and Estes Park is fabulous. And we kind of live in a slightly remote area. We're really close to the center of town, but tourists don't drive through here. So it's very quiet, and that is wonderful for me, just the peace of mind and being out and having access to nature. We go hiking almost daily, and that is absolutely wonderful. Of course, most of the drawbacks, it's not a large community to draw on for a big book event, but I just had a launch here at the local independent bookshop, McDonald's bookstore, which I have to shout out to because they're wonderful. And we drew in a lot of tourist traffic, which was wonderful. And, you've got a community here all year long, and they tend to be pretty active readers, which is lovely. And they've got a very robust library system, which is wonderful. And I'll be doing a keynote speech for them in February. So I'm excited for that.
That's great. Yeah, for those who don't know, it's one of the sort of entryways to Rocky Mountain National Park from the east side. And it can get absolutely, downtown can get just crawling with tourists, but much different lifestyle than Denver, and probably a little more winter too. I bet the seasons last a little longer up there.
That's true. Summer is shorter and winter is longer. When we moved into our house in early April, there was snow on the ground. And so when we realized that our yard was beautifully landscaped and had tons of flowers, it was a lovely surprise come May and June. So, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, did your writing schedule and productivity change having moved to a quieter, smaller town?
The schedule really is more dependent on my children's school schedule. And so once we transitioned out of homeschooling, thank goodness, that was the thing that really opened up time. I do have to schedule around more hiking because I live here now. And unfortunately, a lot of the prime time to get out and be active, which is really important. You cannot be a productive writer if you neglect your health. I will fight anybody who says otherwise. But of course, especially in the summer, in the rainy season, you have to get out first thing in the morning, which is my ideal time to write. So, that's a little bit of it takes some adjusting, but I think being adaptable is an important skill as an author for sure. But
Yep. Very good. Wow. All right. Well, Bakery in Paris. I went online and looked at the description, the two timelines and really interesting setup. I have to say, very intriguing. Why don't you walk us through those, the basic idea of a bakery in Paris?
Well, I pitched it as Les Miserables, Mis Chocolat, and I kind of think that I do serve those two very disparate books actually quite well, because we have the social conflict of Les Miserables, especially in the 1870s timeline, which takes place during the siege of Paris and the Paris Commune, and is a really kind of pivotal part of Parisian history that's undersung. Which is, kind of my brand. I like shedding light on lesser known parts of history. And it was a period where, France had a monarchy again. We talk about the French Revolution as being the end of the French monarchy, and they had a monarchy again 12 years after the revolution. And so it reestablished itself a number of times before it completely dissipated. But they lost Prussia invaded, which is Germany, invaded, and they encircled Paris, and it created a lot of hardship for the people of Paris because it's a walled city. You can't get in or out. You just can't. And when it's surrounded, and so people were starving. Orders were given to eat pets and horses and zoo animals. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And the people had it with the poor mismanagement of the city, of the country. And so the working class of Paris, specifically in the higher numbered arrondissement, if you look at a grid of Paris, there are 20 neighborhoods or quarters in Paris, and numbers 18, 19, and 20, that would be Montmartre, La Villette, and Ménilmontant, are the working class. Now they're sort of hipster, but they were the working class districts of Paris, and they were, they'd had it, and they were starving, and so they rose up to govern themselves. And unfortunately, it was brutally put down by the government, but they never had a monarchy again. And there was a lot of reprisal against how swift the retribution was against the communards. So that's the Les Mis part of things. And we have a young woman, Lisette, who is from easy circumstances, who realizes the privilege she has and realizes that if she continues on her life path, she's never going to be able to look herself in the mirror once she realizes what the common people of Paris are going through. And she meets a National Guardsman and decides to forsake all of her privilege to live a life of purpose. And she opens up a bakery in order to feed the people of Montmartre. And we talk about food deserts today. It was an issue back in the 1870s as well. If people had to walk an hour to the nearest bakery, or a half hour even, that's a tremendous amount of time out of their day. And everything, obviously, this is the pre-mechanized world, took forever. Every household chore was a massive undertaking. And so by her opening up a bakery in the neighborhood, it was saving people an hour out of their day, which was significant. And so it was her way of helping the neighborhood without acting like she's treating them like charity cases, which would not have been well received. And then we contrast that with the 1946 timeline, which is post-World War II. We have a character who's lost her mother. She'd gone missing in the last days of the war, and her father was killed in the first days of the war, as many young Frenchmen were. And so she's left at the age of 19 to raise her 8 and 12-year-old sisters. And she's left without a lot of resources to do so, with the exception of the shop that had been abandoned. It had been a bistro. The tenants left, and so she's left without that income source. And her neighbor convinces her to reopen the bakery and take it back to its roots. And so hers is a struggle to find her own agency throughout the story. And and she learns to fall in love with baking. And so that's kind of the chocolat part of the equation.
Wow. So just to be clear, are the bakery, obviously the building itself is the common bricks and mortar.
Yeah, it's a common theme.
Yeah, but are the families and the different stories connected, or is that a spoiler?
No, it's not a spoiler. They are great granddaughter, great grandmother related. And Micheline from 1946 finds her great grandmother's recipe book, and we see that strewn throughout the book. And it's not the whole magic talisman, like, oh, I found my great grandmother's recipe book that we've seen done, you know, and it's beautiful and it's cute and charming. I love those books, but I wanted it to be something like a living document that Micheline starts adding to once she becomes more proficient in the kitchen. And she keeps it with her as a lucky talisman, but it isn't like the enchanted cookbook trope that we see in a lot of women's fiction, which I love, but I wanted to do something different with this one.
How aware is the 1940s family aware of what happened in the 1870s?
Not terribly.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of the story is lost to time because people were too busy to keep historical records back then. She didn't keep, I mean, she is able to read some of her grandmother's story through the recipes, because it's not, if you read, the recipes aren't just a list of ingredients. There's notes, and she can glean some of her great grandmother's personality, but she doesn't know a lot of the intricacies. For example, the importance of the beautiful rose bush on their trellis is a lovely little symbol that I won't spoil, but it is a carryover from her great grandmother's legacy.
Gotcha. Did you start with one timeline or the other? Did the whole double action, double timeline thing come to you right away, or did you start in one and then said, let's go back or let's go forward?
You know, I conceived because when I was first dating Jeremy, my husband, it was early 2020, and things were starting to lock down, and we were kicking around ideas because he's a historian, and you know, a pickup line is, "Hey, you read any good books on the Gilded Age lately?" And so I said, you know, I was kicking around ideas, and he said, "You should write about the Paris Commune." And I Googled to refresh my memory because it'd been since grad school that I'd learned about the Paris Commune. And I said, that's a great concept, but I had to think about how can I make this marketable and how can I transition? Because you notice in my oeuvre, I've written a lot of World War fiction. And so how can I transition? And so I thought, I'm going to do a post-war timeline to connect the two. And it'll still be, you know, lots of, you know, the grist that people like for my previous book. And a lot of, you know, great discussion points for book clubs, but also, you know, diverging into something new, but something still familiar in one timeline. And I actually did write all of Lisette, the 1870s timeline first, which is a new thing for me. I mean, I did write a few chapters of each to get started, obviously, because you have to do that for a proposal. But then I, you know, just set Micheline aside for a little bit. And there was going to be a third timeline in the 1990s that was going to connect, that was going to bridge the two. But I started with all of Lisette's and wrote 50,000 words. And I'm like, wow, that's more than a third of a book. Ouch, this is going to be really long. But I figured, okay, she'll be the anchor of the whole book. That's fine. But I had a lot to say about Lisette. And then I started writing Micheline's, and it was like already at 30,000 words. And I said, this is going to be a monster if I keep going. And so I skipped to the third timeline, which was going to be Veronica. And I tried, and I rewrote, even though it was the first chapter I'd written for the whole book, I tried like 3 different times to write that first chapter, and it was not working. And so I emailed my editor, Tessa, do you mind if I drop this 1990s timeline? Because it's just not coming together. And she said, you do what you've got to do. You know, obviously I'll give my feedback, but I think you'll be fine. And so what I did was I expanded Micheline's timeline to another, you know, so it's like 45,000 words, and then interspersed the recipes to be the bridge between the two. And I was always going to have a few, but I upped that number to 12, I believe. And, you know, cut Veronica out of the picture because it was just too much. It would have had to be too much finagling and shoehorning of the stories to make it feel cohesive. And I thought the two stories worked well enough together.
Yeah. Well, at this point, when in terms of, you know, giving you some license to do what you want to do, you've got a strong track record. And so they, you know, both, I mean, your editor should trust you at this point when you get in the middle of something and your instincts rise up and tell you something.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful feeling. It's a wonderful
Yeah.
feeling that I've earned my stripes. And this is only the second book that we've written together. And but obviously she's aware of my backlist and aware of my past record, and she trusted me, and that felt amazing. And when I sent it to her, she wrote back after she'd read the manuscript in all capitals, "I love this book," with about 18 exclamation points after it. And that felt so good, because this is really the book that, it seems like every book has its challenges, but some books are really harder than others. Like The School for German Brides, it was such dark subject material and written during the worst part of the pandemic. And it was the book that I had to survive. I'm immensely proud of that book, and it's done well. But this was a book, it was kind of like, the reopening of the world and hope. And it was just the book that, that and Girls on the Line are the two books I felt like flowed really easily, that I was meant to tell those stories. And so I'm really emotionally invested in A Bakery in Paris, more than some of my other works. Not that I don't love them, but it was just one of those books that I feel like there's a lot of me in the pages. And that she came back with such glowing praise felt amazing.
Yeah. I love the fact that you said your editor, this is the second book you wrote together, and you gave your editor that level of involvement.
Yeah, she's a very, very busy woman. And I don't, it's not like we're in constant contact. We were in contact more in the marketing phase than we are in the writing phase. But when she wrote back to say, "I love this book," there's an intense period where we are, editing back and forth, and she'll come back with, and it was longer for German Brides than it was for A Bakery in Paris. But, the editorial letters are like 8 pages long, or 16, what have you. And there's a lot to wade through, and we have to discuss, whether or not she's seeing my vision, which she usually does. And discussing like whether or not this edit is going to be feasible, or if it's tugging at a thread on a sweater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, you mentioned marketing. Give us an idea of, you've been running around.
Oh yeah. So I went on tour. This is my first time getting to do a tour, and I did hire outside publicity for this book because I believed in it so much. And also it was coming out in a really crowded season. Which is becoming more and more true, and there's more and more competition, and the table space is becoming more limited. Literally, Costco, if you've been inside, their table size has shrunk to 1/8 of its original size, which is heartbreaking. But it's just the reality of the world we're publishing in. But yeah, I went to 8 different cities. I did events everywhere from Salt Lake to Scottsdale, Arizona, all along the West Coast. I got to visit my hometown near Placerville, California, and did a great event there. It was packed. I was glad my fire marshal father wasn't counting noses. And but it was, it was wonderful. And to be able to share my story directly with readers was a great experience. And I do love the idea of, making those relationships with booksellers and readers face to face, because it's something that I've only done on a limited basis in Colorado, basically, up to this point.
Any tips about setting up those kinds of tours, or how you survived it?
Well, I did have help from my outside publicist, and they were very instrumental in communicating. Obviously, the big thing is, and I've heard horror stories about this, always be in contact with whatever bookseller you're dealing with to make sure that they have copies of your book in stock, especially if you're flying. And you can't, because I hauled a box of books in the back of my car in the event of emergency, and we didn't have to tap into them, but I made sure that my people at William Morrow and my outside publicist checked with every venue to make sure that they had copies of the book, because you do not want to show up and spend the time and the energy, your extrovert points, basically to do an event where they can't sell books, because that's the whole point is, it's sharing your story, but also selling some books.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it is a business, and you don't have to go out and break the bank and do a crazy multi-city event. We visited family, so if you got free places to stay, we did a road trip, and we tried to do it on the cheap, but it was, there's no such thing as a cheap book tour if you're going very far. But, try to pick places where you have a lot of connections. My best event was the one in my hometown. And, my 3rd grade, everybody from my 3rd grade teacher to family, friends, and, some people off the street too, which was lovely. But, you want to go where you've got some ties. But then again, I don't know anybody in Scottsdale, Arizona, really, and we had a packed house. And so also, partnering with the right bookstores that do promote the events is wonderful.
Yeah. That's great. Excellent.
Yeah.
Good deal. So what is happening with historical fiction these days? What does the future look like? I mean, you pay attention. It looks like you're pay attention to the industry pretty closely. What's your take on things?
I feel like we're kind of in a precipice between big things. Now, for when I first started writing, the Tudor era was big, but it was on its way out. And that's why I was able to get my entree with Canadian colonials, because who writes Canadian colonials? But it was like, well, we don't know what the next big thing is. It could be Canada, who knows? Or North American historical fiction, we don't know. And then it was the world wars. You had the World War II craze, and there's always a steady readership there, but it got big, like the big female forward spy novels. Kate Quinn helped usher that in with the Alice Network. And it being the very first Reese Witherspoon book club pick was a big deal, obviously. And there was lots of great movies and TV shows that helped support that, and World War I with the Downton Abbey craze. And so those things have been holding an audience for a long time. And I think now that is shrinking a little bit. People are saturated. Now, that's not to say that if you found some unique corner of World War II history, kind of like the German bride schools, that you couldn't get interest there. Or if you're established like a Pam Jenoff, or, Kate Quinn can write whatever she wants. But as far as eras go, she could successfully write wherever. But so established World War II authors, they will probably be able to write that forever, whereas Tudor authors, maybe not as much, unless you're like one of the big two, like Philippa Gregory or Alison Weir. But I think we don't know what the next big thing is. And so that'll be interesting to see how it develops, the next big era. I know that biographical historical fiction is having a moment. How long that lasts, I don't know, but I'm glad my next historical is biographical fiction, so that'll be nice. But it was because I happened to find a subject in an era that I liked, which is Clary Fell. It takes place basically 10 years after the first installment of A Bakery in Paris. They're the first half of A Bakery in Paris. And it surrounds Clary Fell, daughter of Gustave Eiffel, around the building of the Eiffel Tower, because she was instrumental in his life. So,
wow. Do you have a working title for that, and how's it coming along?
Yeah, it's Mademoiselle Eiffel. My editor should be reading it any moment, so I'm frantically just adding a few things here and there before she reads it, because I've told her to send me a little message before you dive in, because I'm tweaking a few things and adding in some details about the era right after the Eiffel Tower that are important for the kind of the denouement of the story. And yeah, it's coming along. It's been hard with the tour and travel, etc., because I did actually get to take a vacation this summer, which is nice, up to Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. And it's it was hard because I did have to set it aside, and other projects came up that like copy edits for my first contemporary came up, and you have to drop everything and get those done in the course of a week or two. And so it's been hard, but I'm hopefully trying to polish it out before my wonderful editor gets to it, so that we're talking about I reckon it to like building a house. By the time your editor gets to it, you want to be talking about fabric samples and drapery and paint swatches. You don't want to be talking about the wiring and the drywall, or God forbid, I mean of course there's always going to be a rough patch of drywall here and there, but God forbid a shaky foundation. You do not want to go in, because you've got one shot to get it right with your editor, and it behooves you to have it as close to perfect as you can. And of course, there's always going to be those moments there. I'm not sure, like this plot point, I'm not sure if it works. I need you to tell me if it works. And that's fine. That's your rough patch of drywall, so to speak. But, you really do want it in fighting shape, because most editors do not have the time to do a second or third pass with you. They just don't.
Well, before we get back to historical fiction, so you just kind of slipped that in there. You've got your first contemporary coming out also.
Yes. Yeah, that's coming out on February 13th. It's called The Memory of Lavender and Sage, and it's about a young woman, Tempesta Luddington, who grew up in the greater New York area, and never felt like she blended in with her family very well. And her mother was from the south of France, and sadly her mother dies when Tempest is quite young. But then after her father dies some years later, she finds out that her mother left her a bit of an inheritance, but everything else went to her younger brother. She decides to use her modest inheritance to go to the south of France and discover a bit about her mother's past. And she learns a lot of interesting things along the way. And it's my tribute to small village life in France and French food. And it is also kind of a tribute to found family.
Wow. What town did you use? A real town in southern France?
I made up a town. It's called Saint-Colombe, but I modeled it off Moussier-Saint-Marie, which is a beautiful, bustling tourist town. But the town in the book is not bustling. So it's like what Moussier, what I imagine. Saint-Colombe is what Moussier-Saint-Marie would be, or could become. Moussier-Saint-Marie is what Saint-Colombe could become, with the right, with enough effort. And we did visit. My husband is a road trip expert, and we find the most out of the way strange places. Everybody goes to Aix-en-Provence and Avignon and all the big cities in the south of France, Marseille, what have you. And we went, kind of out of the way, little villages, and we found this village called Bien, like 600 people, and there was like nothing there. I mean, you had to choose what days you'd go to the grocery store because it was open like 4 days a week. And it was charming. It's this beautiful medieval village that had been there well over 1,000 years, and it's dying. And so this novel kind of does deal with that issue.
Well, southern France is one of my favorite regions in the world. It's just incredible.
It's
yeah.
I lived there for a year. Yeah.
Where did you live?
I lived in Avignon. I lived in one of the big cities because obviously I was a university student, so I had to be where there was a university program. But my host parents were definitely old school Provençal, and so they took me to some of the regions outside of Avignon. They grew up like my host mother grew up in Uzès, which is where they filmed Cyrano de Bergerac. So it's like living in a fairy tale. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, coming back to historical fiction just for a second,
Sure.
Do you find that this whole issue, sometimes people read historical fiction, they look for parallels to what's going on today, or maybe they read historical fiction purposely to not think about what issues might be percolating and bubbling around today. And as an author, I'm just throwing this out there, do you find yourself steering clear of trying to send any kind of message back to the now of today? Or do you
I always do.
Do you go in it just for the story itself?
Well, I mean, obviously the story has to be paramount, but like in A Bakery in Paris, we have this struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And we look at the economic trajectory of the United States and the fact that people, barely younger than me, and I'm in my early 40s, I'll claim early 40s for a little bit longer, that can't afford a house in their, late 30s. And if you look at the buying power of people in my parents' generation, compared to what we have now, and especially a generation just behind me, because I'm kind of like on the cusp between X and Generation X and M millennial. And I just understand the anger that leads up to something like a small revolution like they had in Paris, and how, the disparate conditions. I mean, the fact that people can't afford basic housing and they're spending incredible amounts on rent. And inflation, doing what it's doing. I mean, we've tempered it down some, but it's incredibly hard to get ahead. And it's not just about sustaining your life; it's about being able to thrive, and that shouldn't be a problem in the wealthiest country in the world. And so my heart aches for the people who are just even the generation younger, and even worse for the generation still to come. And it's my belief that every generation should be able to be a bit more prosperous than the ones that came before. And so I understand, when we have wealth held by a few oligarchs and the rest of us on the ground struggling to just make ends meet, I understand where the frustration came for the people in the Paris Commune, for sure.
That's great. That's great. Wow. Mm. So in terms of driving the agenda for historical fiction, do you feel like you want to play a role in that some way, somehow? Are you casting about for another overlooked moments or periods of time? Is that how do you
Well,
know?
yeah,
What goes through
I
your
really,
head?
yeah, I focus rather than more. I mean, it would be easier if I focused on one era from a research perspective, but I get, it's my squirrel brain, ADHD. I like to move around. And it would be easier to specialize, but I'm kind of focused more on social history and inequalities and social issues like class struggles, becoming more and more a theme in my work. That's less of an issue. It's less of a theme in Mademoiselle Eiffel, but hers is more. It's more of an intimate, kind of personal narrative. But it's definitely prevalent in a bakery in Paris. And the next historical I want to write definitely has to do with working class struggle issues. I can't say a word about it yet because it's not under contract. But I'm really hoping that one is snapped up, because I think we have such a hyper spotlight, and well as it should be, on gender issues and on racial issues, but we're leaving behind the class issues. And it's true that people of reduced means and people coming from generational poverty, and of course there's often a strong correlation with race, but not always, it's hard for them to get ahead. And I want to shine some spotlight on that. And workers' rights, oh my goodness, workers' rights, so important.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you've got plenty of fuel in the tank.
Yes, absolutely. Lots of books to write.
That's great. And I think you also need a tour through France now at this point with translations.
Oh yeah, well, I have not had any of my works translated into French yet, sadly, but I've just found out today that it looks like A Bakery in Paris is going to get translated into Ukrainian, so
That's
that's cool.
fantastic.
Yeah, and
That
Dutch,
is
Dutch
really
and
cool.
Ukrainian. Yeah, and so each of my
Fantastic.
books has been translated into a few, save the first two, but they've all had at least one translation. But I haven't had the opportunity to visit any of the countries to do a tour. But Poland did an amazing release for German brides, and it just came out in Spain, so it's very exciting.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow, Aimie, congratulations on everything. This is fantastic. Really
Thank
great.
you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah. Wow. Aimie, just as we wrap up, we always like to mention a writer or book, something you've read recently. Do you want to pass along, just to shine a
Oh,
spotlight on somebody else?
yeah, absolutely. I am listening to on audiobook Anne Garvin's There's No Coming Back from This, which is a story about a woman who is swindled out of a money, or actually gets accused of tax evasion, thanks to an unscrupulous accountant. And she ends up, through a series of mishaps, ended up in Hollywood working as a costume designer on a movie set. And it's fascinating, as far as a deep dive into the world of Hollywood, but also a woman who's learning to trust after she's had her trust violated time and time again. And it's moving. And Anne Garvin's tagline is, I think everything is funny, but and a little bit sad. And that it actually permeates every word in this book, and it's absolutely charming. So I can't recommend it enough.
Fantastic. Great.
Yeah.
Aimie, thanks a million. We'll catch up with you down the road. Good luck with the continuing launch of A Bakery in Paris, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you so very much.